Thanks be to God that he blessed St. Matthew's with such strong leadership and vision in the 1930s. Because the 1940s was a time when it seemed like this whole world had been flipped upside down. World War II had broken out, and the U.S.'s involvement changed everything, including for the people of St. Matthew's.
The war affected basically every aspect of life during the 1940s. It was what we kind of called total war. So the economy shifted into a war economy.
The United States government rationed many goods for civilians in order to focus production in support of the war effort. This meant that, for example, people could only buy a certain amount of tires, gasoline, shoes, even sugar was rationed.
And all of that kind of trickled down then through everyday life. So you think about, some of the traditions that our churches have today, potlucks. That was a strong tradition back then as well. The food rationing, that would have affected what women brought to the potlucks.
St. Matthew's decided to hold congregational meetings right after worship services, rather than in the evenings or during the week, in order to reduce the amount of times that members drove to church, reserving that rationed gasoline as much as possible. There was one person at St. Matthew's, however, who would have been granted extra rations. As was the case with all pastors at that time, Pastor Paustian was able to apply for extra gasoline rations in order to carry out ministry, to visit shut-ins, for example.
They were allotted higher rations than what civilians were. At the peak of gas rationing, civilians got 2 gallons a week of gas. So really, it affected every aspect of everyone's life here in America.
In addition to the ability to apply for extra rations of gasoline, Pastor Paustian was also exempt from the draft, allowing him to stay in Oconomowoc and serve the members of St. Matthew's during this time of difficulty, change, and sometimes loss.
The government understood what a strong role religion played in the lives of Americans. A lot changed in a very short amount of time leading into World War II. Almost overnight, things changed. Pastors played a very strong role in counseling those who lost loved ones, during World War II, or who ended up with wounded sons and husbands and stuff like that. They really were kind of this foundation of America.
And in the same way that Pastor Paustian supported the members of St. Matthew's, members also supported Pastor Paustian and his family.
When I was growing up, we lived rather close to the church. My grandmother lived 3 houses down the way, and she had a big garden. And whenever something was ripe in the summer, she'd call up my parents and say, "Send Marlene over with my red wagon." She'd load up my wagon, and I'd come over here to the church and rap on the parsonage door, and Mrs. Paustian would come, and we'd give her whatever I was given. That's what they did back then. They shared the produce. If you were a farmer, you'd give them a half a cow, something. And that was a payment for the pasture. They didn't get a lot of salary back then.
The ability to buy goods or basic needs even after the war had ended was still very difficult. For the number of years that our country was involved in the war, the economy had halted production on many things, therefore causing an undersupply.
New car production stopped in 1942. You could not buy a new car. You couldn't buy a car in 1942 until the end of the war. Things were rationed, but that didn't mean that they were available. Shoes were rationed. You could buy 3 pairs of shoes a year. And that included kids whose feet grow dramatically in the course of a year. And just because you could buy 3 pairs of shoes a year didn't mean you'd find 3 pairs of shoes a year.
So now that the war had ended, there was plenty of opportunity to make money, but not much to spend it on. That imbalance of supply and demand, mixed with the generosity of the people of St. Matthew's and the grace of God, could be what led to a great milestone in the history of this congregation in 1944. Pastor Paustian put it this way in his year-end letter to the congregation.
In spite of trying and discouraging world conditions, aggravated because of the present worldwide war and the sorrows it brings with it. The gospel will not return void, but will accomplish that which pleases the Lord. It is not in this that this year has been outstanding over any other year, for the Lord's mercy has always been, and still is, new unto us every morning. But outstanding during 1944 is the fact that the year 1944 marks the year in which the congregation, for the first time in its history, has become debt-free. By the grace of God, the entire mortgage of the church has now been paid off.
There's always blessing in the dark, tragic things of life. And the Lord has, in His mysterious way, works those great wonders.
But that letter, I'm going to print out for the 40s and let everybody read that. It's just a beautiful conviction of his faith and of how the people helped lower this debt that we had here.
If we remain faithful to Him and to His word, threatening clouds may hover for the time being, but behind a frowning providence, He hides a smiling face. Whatever the new year may hold in store for us, may we learn more and more to trust Him fully and completely.
Beyond the financial blessings of a post-war St. Matthew's, the late 1940s brought growth in the number of souls as well. Due to the spreading of the gospel in Oconomowoc and the baby boom, a new need for the congregation came about. And by the grace of God, that would lead to yet another milestone for this group of believers in the decade to come.